Over time, chronic sleep deficits are associated with higher levels of chronic disease, with potentially, it looks like, a greater risk of neurodegenerative or brain diseases, things like Alzheimer's and dementias. And of course, chronic sleep deficits also, in the shorter run, have a significant impact on your ability to perform at work.
Welcome back to another episode of the Not Almost There podcast. I'm your host, Joe Chura. That was Alex Pang, who you just heard from, who's an academic Ph.D. who started his career studying people, technologies, and the worlds they make. Since 2000, Alex has worked as a technology forecaster and futurist, helping companies understand new tech and global trends and their strategic and business implications. Alex is the author of a few great books, and this is how I found him: from The Distraction Addiction, which deals with technology, addiction, and distraction. By the way, I love your descriptive titles, Alex. A book called Shorter, which is about doing more with less, and Rest, which we dive into today a lot. We talk about how you can get more done when you give yourself ample rest. And don't worry, we really dive into what that means. It's probably not what you think. And also in this episode, we take a deeper look into the work week, employee burnout, and how our perception of productivity needs to be completely reconstructed. Alex leaves us with great actionable tips on how to take planned breaks from intense work to enhance your creativity and capacity. But for now, let's get right into it. Put on those shoes, go for a walk or run, or better yet, just rest as we explore the mind of Alex Pang. Why is rest so important, and just as important as work in some cases, but it's often something that we don't talk about, or we don't feel it's as important as work or getting outcomes that we're striving for?
Right. So as for the question of why rest is important, I think that there were two answers. The first and most obvious one is that rest is essential as a source of, sort of restoration, as an opportunity to recharge the mental and physical batteries that we spend at work, dealing with children, managing the complexities of life under a pandemic and sort of normal life, and so generally sort of recovering the energy we need in order to in order to be good people. More specifically, though, for people who are ambitious, who see themselves as high achievers or who aspire to be high achievers, rest plays a hidden but really essential role in their success because number one, the right kinds of rest provide a kind of wellspring for creative thinking, a kind of playground in which your creative mind can try out new ideas, can think through different possibilities, and can potentially solve problems that elude your conscious effort. I think we all have the experience of, you're trying to remember the name of that actor who was in the movie and the TV show and the other thing, and they can't, and you struggle, but you can't, and then 3 minutes later you're folding laundry or emptying the dishwasher, and all of a sudden their name pops into your head, right? Oh, right, that was Chris Helmsworth. Well, that's a very trivial but everyday version of something that our minds are really, really good at, which is continuing to work on problems even when our conscious attention is elsewhere. Our minds really don't like to leave these things unsolved. And so they go back to them when there are kind of few spare processor cycles, when we're doing something relatively cognitively low intensity. And so that's where that kind of sort of experience comes from. The thing is that so far as we can tell, the mechanisms by which we remember who was in Thor and also in Extraction are also the same cognitive mechanisms that we use for solving really serious problems, whether they are, sort of trying to figure out sort of the last step in some scientific theory, whether it's a business strategy, whether it's, some difficult challenge at work. And so creating space in your day for periods where your creative mind can think about those problems makes it more likely that you will be able to solve them. And so super creative people, who have a lot of freedom over their time, a lot of control over their schedules, will actually design their days to kind of build in periods of downtime, usually after some really intensive few hours of work, so that number one, they get up and stretch and get a break from, simply being at their desks. But second, by doing so immediately after periods of intensive work, you've still got all these, questions and short-term variables and things kind of running around in your head. And the odds of being able to come up with a solution to a problem are greater in those minutes and hours immediately after that hard work. And so that's why there's value in working rest into your daily schedule rather than assuming that it's something that you should reserve for, that cool 2-week vacation that you take once a year. So, and so because of this, because our subconscious is so good at working on problems that elude our sort of conscious solution, that's why working rest into your daily schedule has sort of immediate value for you as a creative or knowledge worker or whatever. There's also really good evidence that people who rest regularly, whether it's on a daily basis, taking vacations, preserving their weekends, live longer, are healthier, are less prone to heart disease and dementias and other things than people who are constant workaholics. As for why it is that this is something whose value we underestimate, there are a couple answers. And one is that it's really, until very recently, we didn't really understand very much about the mechanisms that sort of connected work and rest, and in particular connected creative problem solving that involved conscious effort versus problem solving that happened when our minds were were working on other things. We all experience those kinds of aha moments, but they had always seemed kind of mysterious, and the role of downtime hadn't really been understood until recently. And then there are 1,001 kind of cultural and normative or professional reasons why we think of rest as something that, we do after we're successful, or that we should sort of, that we avoid doing very publicly because, either because we are in professions where sort of long hours serve as a demonstration of your passion and your commitment, or because, all our friends are working this way. And so, we tend to, and we pick up cues from them. Or if you're in, the kind of job where, that's highly competitive, it's a great strategy for showing that you are, a committed, dedicated employee and that you should be kept around and promoted. So for all of those reasons, we tend to downplay or underestimate the value of rest, despite the fact that in creative lives, it plays this really critical role of sort of restoration, of sort of inspiration, and of making our lives and our work sort of better and more sustainable. So that's why.
That makes a lot of sense. And to unpack rest, I know in the book you talk about deep play, you talk about sleep and naps, you talk about vacation. One of the things that I found interesting, and I find that works for me personally, and I know other folks it works for as well, is breaking up your day into some unorthodox way. And you give some great examples that I'd like for you to dive into a little bit more in the book with regards to Darwin and Hemingway. Mm-hmm. And we can learn a lot from history and the success of some of these folks over time. What is there one of those historical figures that stand out to you that is like the model for this, or?
You know, I certainly have my own favorites. I mean, I think that, and one of the things that's really clear from this work is that everybody's got to figure out the particular model that works best for them. And indeed, that works for them at this stage in their lives, right? You know, your energy levels, you know, how much sleep you need, these change a lot over the course of your life. And so an ideal solution when you're 25 is probably not going to be the same as an ideal solution when you're 40 and you've got a couple kids and also the nature of your work has changed. However, when you look across a whole bunch of creative lives, and I'm talking about like Nobel Prize winners and famous writers and composers and even some generals, that you find that what these people will do is, first of all, like I said earlier, they layer periods of work and rest in their days. And they do that partly for restoration and partly for the kind of creative stimulus. They also will do their hardest work kind of first in the day, very often getting up super early to write or whatever, at like 5 or 6 a.m. And they'll schedule about 4 hours or 5 hours of really intensive work. And that's when the bulk of what they do, the bulk of their work and their creative thinking happens. So, and that 4 to 5 hours number is really consistent, whether you're talking about like mathematicians or novelists or, Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert. And it seems like most people are capable of about 4 really serious hours of concentrated cognitive work per day, day in and day out. The model in college where, you work super, super hard, before finals, you're studying 12 hours a day. That's something you can sustain for brief periods. But if you want to have a good career, you want to do really good work, it's not really the model that works over the long run. So layering periods of serious work, doing that and setting aside times when you are best able, when you're kind of maximum sort of creativity and energy level, which tends for most people to be in the mornings, either because of their circadian rhythms. More of us are early risers than late risers or night owls, first of all. And second, because if you buy the idea that you kind of have a finite amount of energy and attention and decision-making power throughout the day, which is slightly controversial, but kind of tracks with I think a lot of our own sort of everyday experiences, doing your biggest work first in an environment where you're able to concentrate hardest makes a lot of intuitive sense. So, whether you are, Darwin or Beethoven or Einstein, early morning, 4 to 5 hours worth of work, the bulk of the stuff, the bulk of your work gets done, and then you kind of switch gears and you spend a couple hours working in the garden, going on a long walk, doing other kinds of apparently unproductive things that give your body a chance to recharge, but while also giving that creative subconscious a chance to keep working on problems even while, your mind is elsewhere. And then you might have a couple ideas about, maybe if I approach the problem this way, or there's this transition that I can use in this movement, and you go and you write that down. That's like another hour or so in the afternoon. And then you're pretty much done for the day. And working in that manner steadily is what allowed, Darwin to write The Origin of Species, Beethoven to do the Fifth Symphony, Hemingway to write As the Bell Tolls, and also allowed all of them to have much longer kind of creative lives than they would had they, had they worked on the kind of crazy, all-out, sort of manner that characterizes so many of our professional and entrepreneurial lives today. So, I think that basic model of thinking about when in the day you are at your own kind of peak, your own kind of creative and energetic peak, taking that time, really, sort of ring fencing it so that nothing else is allowed to intrude in it, using it to work on your most important problems, setting aside time in your schedule during the day for, for serious breaks, whether it's a walk or CrossFit or yoga or something else. Those things are, I think, essential for, for doing really great work, for doing really creative work, and I think also for making work more sustainable.
Yeah, I think the sustainability is a key thing, right? If you know tomorrow you're going to have to spend 8 hours behind a computer, behind your desk in virtual meetings, it's wearing just thinking about it. It's
Absolutely.
One thing to get through a day, but the next day, the crazy thing about all of this is McKinsey did a study I read a few years ago, and they dove deep into how much productivity you're actually getting out of an employee per day. It equates to like 3 hours, if that. So if you think about it, what are you doing with the rest of the time? You're just kind of there. You're just, you're existing versus okay, if you can really focus your 4 hours, you'll actually get 20 to 25% more productivity out of designing your day in an unorthodox way versus just following the 9 to 5 that society has kind of taught us over time, and you're not going to get as much out.
Exactly. It's also worth noting that 9 to 5 is very much a 19th century kind of industrial model of work, where you show up at the factory and you're doing the same job from start to finish. You're sort of assembling this widget or twisting this bolt or what have you, and that there is no variability in sort of in the kind of mix of things that you're doing. And the other assumption is that in order to get people to do more, what you do, you either speed up the factory line or you extend the length of the day. And cognitive work, creative work, knowledge work, these all work quite differently, right? There are really hard limits on how much extra labor you can extract from people before you burn them out. It's also the case that creative work is very susceptible to fluctuations in our circadian rhythms. We are able to do a lot more when we're at our peak than when we are at our lows, and so I think that if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, and you're asking, in a knowledge economy, how would you design the workday? It would not look like the conventional 9 to 5. It also, the other thing that you would look at is not just kind of internal factors, human factors, and how they relate to how we work. We'd also think differently about our environments as well, and how much time we would schedule for things like meetings and when we would schedule them. Right? That McKinsey study and virtually every other study of time spent in the workplace, identifies meetings as basically a huge time sink. Meetings are necessary, but they tend to be overly long. They have too many people. They're too meandering. I'm not saying anything that that most of us haven't experienced. And indeed, what we find is that people lose something like between 2 and 4 hours of potentially productive time per day, before COVID anyway, to overly long meetings, distraction, interruptions, people coming by with one quick question that turns into a 10-minute conversation that, requires then another 10 minutes for you to kind of get back on track on sort of what you were working on before the interruption. And when you're able to get a handle on those things, you can get amazing increases in productivity. And indeed, doing that allows you to do things like move an entire company to a 4-day week, where, people are still able to do the same amount of work. You're serving customers, you're just as profitable as you were before, but you get all the work done in 4 days rather than in 5. So, the bottom line is that there are lessons here that are not just for individuals, but there also are really important lessons for organizations as well.
So let's take this smaller chunk of focus time, whether it's 4 days a week, 5 days a week. One of the things that I heard you say that it's really profound and a different way to think about things is, I think it was a quote from someone, and you would know as soon as I say it, but you can get more done in a week by focusing on one thing a day than focusing on a bunch of problems that you're going to try and solve over a week, meaning that 4-hour period. If you're focused and you're like, I'm going to knock this out, I'm going to put a lot of attention to it, and then move on and focus on the next thing, you're going to be far more ahead without putting in those 8 hours being scattered.
Right. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that that 1 unit of focus time, let's say 1 hour, is worth about 4 hours of semi-distracted, semi-structured time. Now, in order to make that valuable, you need a couple things, right? You basically need, a purpose or goal or, clarity about what it is that you ought to be working on. Number 2, you need conditions that support focused work, which can be quiet for some people. It can be music blasting through headphones for others. But, you need some kind of support that helps you get into kind of the into flow, or help you get into, kind of deep work, as Cal Newport says. The other thing that's really important is to have a social environment and other people who share with you the recognition that this is really important, right? My ability to concentrate in the office depends a lot on my colleagues' ability to respect my time, to recognize that there's value in working in this way, and and to recognize that we all should pursue this. We should all set aside time to work in this manner, and that if we do so, we will all be a lot more productive and a lot happier than if we, if we allow the workplace to be a kind of, the sort of carnival of distractions that all too often it becomes. So, basically, focus good and other focused people really, really good.
Who is doing it right currently or in this environment? I know you consult with a lot of companies, and you live in essentially Silicon Valley still, I believe.
Yep.
And you've been there for decades. Have you seen companies embrace this, and what are the outcomes from an employee satisfaction, from an output standpoint, just overall?
Right. Okay. So there are what the business literature and the literature on workplace happiness tells us is that giving people giving more control over their work days, more control over their time, helps people be happier at work, feel that their work is more meaningful, they have greater sense of, autonomy, et cetera. So, first of all, giving people a little more control over their schedules has those kinds of benefits pretty much no matter where you are. As for organizations that are, that I think are in the lead in terms of recognizing the value of rest, designing strategies that take advantage of it in order to get better performance for the entire organization and better performance and among employees and happier employees. I would look to the companies that have moved to 4-day weeks, because they are places that really have to do this right. Right. In order to, if you're going to get the same work done and have everyone leave by the end of day Thursday, that creates a great incentive for organizations to tighten up their processes, to tighten up their schedules, to figure out how to use meetings more effectively, use technology better. And within this, I think that the couple examples for me that really come to mind, Perpetual Guardian in New Zealand, which is one of the first companies to pioneer the 4-day, sort of a 4-day work week, I think offers, and they have studied their own daily calendars and schedules pretty extensively. I think they offer a really nice example. There is, one of my favorites is a company in the UK called Flock that divides the day into red time, amber time, and green time. And red time is heads down, focused work, and that happens first thing in the morning and then in the afternoon. Amber time is for meetings, it's for time with clients, and then green time is social time. And they're really, really explicit about when you're in this one versus the other. And the virtue of that is that while it sounds kind of regimented and almost sort of childish. And in fact, the founder of the company was previously an elementary school teacher. So he says,
makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And he says that this was inspired partly by his experience as a teacher. But, I think what it teaches us is, first of all, that kind of regularity turns out to have benefits over the long run for individuals, but also that when everybody is following that kind of schedule together, you get a kind of multiplier effect that you can't get when everyone is trying to do this on their own. I think we all have that experience of having to, escape to the cafe downstairs or, work at home when we need to really get stuff done. And it illustrates the ways in which, the modern office often is a place that, where we work despite the negative effect it can have on our productivity and our ability to concentrate. And so I think that these companies offer a really nice model, both of what these kinds of daily schedules can look like, but also why crafting these schedules for everybody turns out to have really great benefits that go well beyond what each individual enjoys as singular economic units or as people.
So when you are working with either retail or companies like mine that support retail, and you have to have client service folks on, you recommend finding sort of flexible work hours within those jobs, or how does that break down?
There are a couple ways that companies will do this. One of them is, government services, for example, will often, if they're reducing working hours for public sector workers, will go from, let's say, a 40-hour week to a 30-hour week, but they will implement 6-hour shifts. So, and then actually keep the offices open longer. So you've got fewer people in the office at any given time, but, as far as the public is concerned, your public face is now open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. rather than from 9 to 5. So you're actually more accessible to the public at large, even while you're reducing working hours for individuals. And then in, let's say, places that run their own customer service lines or call centers, generally what they will do either is have a rota like that, or if after looking at your inbound inquiries and discovering really that they are spread out fairly evenly across the 5 days, stagger shifts so that some people will be Monday through Thursday and some will be Tuesday through Friday. One of the important things there, though, is actually looking, not assuming that you really do have to be on the phones 24/7 or 5 days a week. Actually looking at your your inbound calls, your sort of your tickets, and seeing are there patterns where there really are days where not very much happens, and every now and then you find that that there are these big kinds of natural rhythms in the work week that that you might not have paid much attention to previously. There's a B2B call center in Glasgow that moved to a 4-day week after realizing that 90% of its its staff made their weekly sales quotas by the end of day Thursday. That basically, and this is a place that sells computer services to other companies. And so basically what they found was that very few buying decisions actually were being made on a Friday anyway. And so rather than trying to, let's say, expand Friday hours or make more calls on Fridays, it made more sense to actually try and train people up so that they could be a little faster Monday through Thursday, and they were a lot more likely to hit their weekly quotas then. And you could then give everybody Friday off and and still be just as profitable as you had been before. So paying attention, looking a little more deeply into the rhythm of the work and how your customers behave can sometimes also yield insights that give you some clues about how you can most effectively work in downtime or even eliminated day from from your daily or your weekly schedule.
For the listeners, before we get too much further into this, because it's super fascinating, how did you get involved in rest? I know you were a futurist in Silicon Valley for a long time, but what was the catalyst to make you start thinking about this in a different way?
Right.
And then write about it?
Yeah. So, I really first appreciated this when about 10 years ago when I was on a sabbatical at Microsoft Research Cambridge in the UK. And, I've been working as a technology forecaster and futurist and consultant for the previous 10 years or so here in the Valley, and lived for years with that sense of always being kind of half a project behind, never having enough time, of always struggling to keep up with stuff. And this is it's a field where there's always more to learn. There's always a little bit more quality that you can deliver to clients, a little bit more stuff that you can do. And that really adds up over time. So I was near the point of burning out. I had the opportunity to kind of take a step back and go to Microsoft and to join one of their research groups there. And about 6 weeks into it, I had this epiphany where I realized I was getting all kinds of amazing stuff done. I was reading a ton. I felt super productive, but I didn't feel the kind of time pressure that was just part of everyday life here in California. And it started me thinking that, maybe our assumptions about the relationship between, working hours and output and productivity and creativity, the assumption that in order to be a success, you have to work heroically, titanically long hours that put you right on the edge of burnout or breakdown, that maybe those assumptions were completely wrong. And that in order to do the kinds of work that we really want to do and to be the people we want to be, that we should think about how we can work effectively, but sort of work less rather than constantly work more. And that was that initial idea kind of ran around in my mind for a while. And eventually I realized that there were a lot of other people, very, famous, accomplished people who had discovered this idea on their own and had put it into practice. And so once I realized that, And I saw that there was a body of scientific work in the psychology of creativity and neuroscience that helped explain why these patterns worked, why it is that working 4 hours a day and taking long vacations and making time for family turns out to be really essential for doing amazingly creative work. Once all that stuff came together, I knew I had a story that was really worth telling. And then, more recently, I've discovered, a bunch of companies that have put this into practice at scale for entire organizations rather than for individuals, most notably by shortening working hours for everybody. And in so doing, they managed to make available to everybody the kinds of free time and a sort of attitude towards time and productivity that characterize the sorts of perspectives that the people I write about in Rest had discovered for themselves. So that's the origin story for for this whole project.
And if a company has the willingness to create this kind of flexible work schedule, what are best practices or things they need to do to actually have people understand that it's okay to have a flexible schedule? From myself personally, as a leader of a company, I care about the output, meaning I care about the outcomes that they're generating. If they can do that in 4 hours versus 8 hours, fist bump, it doesn't matter. If you can, I used to work on an assembly line, and if I could crank in this example, you couldn't, but if I could build 72 cars within a half hour versus an hour, Ford wouldn't have cared, it wouldn't have mattered. So I'm just curious, what do people and companies need to do to get this right?
Right. So, there were a few things that everybody does very consistently. First of all, make meetings a lot shorter, more pointed, more purposeful. At every place I go into, there are artifacts or there are practices that reinforce that. So, it's like reverse countdown timers that only go to 20 minutes, for example. Changes in calendaring systems, so that the default length for a meeting is no longer an hour, but it is 20 minutes or 30 minutes. One place even has 2 sets of meeting rooms for external meetings with clients, and they've got some nice comfy chairs and, coffee service. And then internal meetings are held at this little uncomfortable table because as a way of incentivizing people to just get in, do the work, and get out. So, making meetings shorter, more pointed, more purposeful is thing number one. Number two is, I think, using technology more thoughtfully. So, and what that means generally is figuring out how you can use things like email, Slack, etc., not to distract people, but rather to to help them focus better. Sometimes that's as simple as a little bit of email, email hygiene combined with implementing email checks a couple times a day rather than throughout the day. The third thing is redesigning the workday to protect periods of focus time and to better maintain boundaries between, let's say, focused work, individual work time, collaborative time or meetings, and more social time. And whether it is red time, amber time, green time, whether it is setting aside, half a day a week for, for thinking about long-term stuff, whether it is a rule where you don't have meetings before, let's say, 1 p.m., having something like that gives people clarity about how they are able to spend their time and reduces the likelihood that there's going to be interference between the needs of a bunch of people who can have a meeting at this time versus a couple others who would really prefer to use that part of the morning for deep work. So that kind of standardization is really valuable for preserving periods for focused work, and interestingly also makes the times when you're just hanging out or you're doing collaborative work, also makes those more potent as well. And just doing those three things, the meetings, the better tech use, the better design of the day of the day, gets you a long way to being able to do 4 days worth of work in 5. There is a little bit, as you indicated, also of kind of cultural shift that happens as well. Thinking it takes a little while, but most places you do see this kind of shift of mindset where you go from thinking that that the really dedicated employees are the ones who can be at their desks for 10 or 12 hours a day, to thinking more in terms of output and saying, is it more impressive to be the person who can do this task in 4 hours, or is it more impressive to be the person who needs 10 hours? And the answer becomes pretty self-evident when you are constructing an environment that encourages people to be thoughtful about their time, to be thoughtful about everybody else's time, and to look for ways to sort of maximize productivity so that you can take those time savings and you can give them back to your employees. So, but, starts with meetings, tech use, day design.
I love some of those tips, especially the reverse timer.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that. That's
exactly.
Brilliant.
No, those are really cool.
What have you learned during the pandemic? Has there been insights coming out of this? I know you're pioneering and trying to bring the 4-hour work, or the 4-day week to the US, but just curious what the pandemic has taught us. I know for me, it's taught me flexibility. It's taught me that I could have meetings while walking. I can arrange my day in a different way, and that I start my day earlier, much earlier. And I find that works well for me. I get the same amount of output and generate the same results as I would otherwise, if not more. So I'm just curious, what else have you seen?
Yeah, one of the things that I have seen is, companies going remote and then discovering that the work that you've got to do in order to make remote work a success, right? Figuring out how to, do meetings differently, have sort of better production project management systems, sort of making that layer run well so that people who previously had been all together in an office are capable of doing the same work even when they're spread out potentially across time zones. That work serves as a kind of foundation for sort of moving to a shorter work week. All of the companies that I've looked at who've moved to a 4-day week during the pandemic have done so after discovering that their technology enables it. I think we also have learned that flexibility can be a really powerful thing if it's used well. I think we need, we've discovered that we need to be thoughtful both in our own lives and in organizations about how we can bring in flexibility in a way that helps, that does not come at the expense of organizational goals or social cohesion. But I think that the challenge going forward is to figure out how to make that work, as opposed to figuring out how to cram people back into the office from 9 to 5 from Monday through Friday. I think that the cat is now out of the bag, despite what folks on Wall Street or investment banks may want to the contrary. I think also that we've learned some stuff about how valuable offices actually are when they work well. That there really are kinds of work that are super difficult to do at home by oneself, and that that there is tacit knowledge that we possess when we are together that we can draw upon and operationalize in ways that are difficult to do when you're talking to people just over a screen. There's a lot of informal social cues and physical stuff that does not make it from one screen to another that enables a level of collaboration and a sort of smoothness in working together that that really can only happen when you are, when people are in the same place. I think also that, that for younger people who are learning how to be professionals or who are still mastering skills of their craft, that we now see how valuable it is to be among others when we're trying to do that. And so I think that trying to replace that stuff with like online mentoring programs or something more formal is a step in the right direction, but I think it can never quite replace the experience of being in the same room with someone who is really, really expert at what you want to learn how to do and seeing how they do it. So that's what I think we've learned.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. At the end of my days, the last thing I want, I don't care who's on the other end of that Zoom screen, is another virtual meeting.
Yeah.
And having an in-person meeting, feeling that energy in a different way, I think is sorely missed. I mean, at least from me. And I'm looking forward to getting back to some of that. We talked about people and kind of like more morning rituals, people that wake up early like myself. What about for night owls? People that don't wake up early, how can they arrange their day to get the most out of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the challenge is to figure out when you are at your kind of creative and energetic peak, and to set that time aside for your most important work. So if that starts at 9 or 10 a.m. rather than at 6 a.m., or if it starts at 4 p.m., whatever, that your task is to be really thoughtful with yourself about what works for you now, and to try to design a day that that maximizes that. The other thing I will say is that humans are not quite as good as we might expect at intuiting that. I am someone who in college I was one of those people who started homework after the evening news, and so very often very often I was up until going to bed at 2 a.m. was generally a pretty good night for me, and I just kind of I assumed that's like how I worked best, and it was not how I worked best. It was how I worked when I was 19, which is not the same thing. But, discovering, and it took me, when I started experimenting with a morning routine, it took me a few weeks to really kind of get into that rhythm. But I find that even though I would not call myself an early, a voluntary or natural early riser, that there is still amazing value to having that practice and having that routine for me. And indeed, there's research that suggests that working against chronotype, if you are doing creative work, can actually be kind of valuable, because if you are, basically if you're a night owl and you get up super early, the working theory is that your subconscious is still kind of a little bit more in the mix than it will be much later in the day, and so you are more likely to have insights or ideas that you wouldn't necessarily have later on. So I think that it's a matter of recognizing when your peak periods are, experimenting with them, and or experimenting with routines that allow you to match up those periods with your key tasks. Now, the obvious question is, if you are, the one night owl in an office full of, early risers, I think that what we find is that coordinating schedules and giving everybody the same time to do really focused work right now has really substantial benefits no matter your chronotype. And that figuring out how to coordinate, how to really precisely fine-tune that stuff for everyone is what companies will do when they want to go from 4-day weeks to 3-day weeks. And it's the next obvious thing to try to do, but nobody has really at the organizational scale attacked that part of it yet.
That's fascinating about the night owl to still, if you're one of those people that go to bed late, you're kind of groggy in the morning, still try and get the work done, your most important work done, because you may benefit from that. So I think that's a really great insight, Alex.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
One of the other I'd just add really quickly that, one of the other things that is really valuable for lots of people is, a nap in the afternoon. And this is both for the restorative purpose, a 20-minute nap can be as good as, yet another cup of coffee to get you through.
You got to explain to me how to do that, though. If your mind's going and during the day, how do you pause and take a nap?
Simple answer is, is practice. Number one, you actually get better at falling asleep during the day if you work at it for a little while. The second thing is making sure that you do so either for the right period of time, which means either about 20 minutes for a cat nap or a full 90 minutes. Because if you go for 40 and you wake up in the middle of deep sleep, then the rest of your afternoon is going to be shot, right? You've got what they call sleep. People call it sleep inertia, and so choosing the right time, the right length of time is thing number one. Number two is this is pretty place dependent. So if you've got a place where you can lie down, I have a hammock, being in California, and that's usually where I take my naps. And that's, just as with sleep at nighttime, having a place that you associate with naps during the day can make it easier for you to actually get to sleep. The third thing is that even if you don't fall asleep completely, just, the physical downtime, closing your eyes, not having the constant barrage of stimulus, that itself can be more restorative than you might imagine. So even if you don't fall all the way asleep, there is value in taking that time and and using it for that kind of a break, whether you fall asleep or not.
And you're talking 20 minutes. What would be the max?
Right. 20 minutes, sleep cycles go about 90 minutes or so. So, that means going from, initial falling asleep to, deep sleep, REM sleep, dreaming, and then back up into the kind of first state that you are when you first fall asleep. That's about 90 minutes or so. A full cycle of that sort is probably the longest that most of us can get away with during the day. However, we shouldn't underestimate the value of the 20-minute nap either, as for its as a way of recharging and allowing mind and body to kind of reset for the afternoon.
So that's a great segue. Diving deeper into sleep, can you break down the basic stages of sleep? Because I think it's important to note, one of the things that I realized recently, and I'm 43 years old, I don't know why this just dawned on me, but for the majority, at least the 10, as far as I can remember back, when I'm shaving off hours in a day, 6 hours of sleep always seemed okay to me. I could operate on 6 hours. And then you think about it as a percentage of the recommended 8 hours of sleep, and you're kind of crushing yourself, and you're losing a cycle of sleep. You're losing REM sleep. But I think to even understand that, we've got to understand the stages of sleep. Can you break down those?
So you've got, there is kind of initial light sleep, which is the first 20 minutes or so. And then there are a couple stages of deeper sleep, right? There is, and the way that sleep scientists measure this is changes in things like eye movement. So if you have, when you're dreaming, for example, your eyelids off, you can see people's eyes moving under their under their eyelids. But basically what's going on is that in each of these different sleep cycles, or parts of the sleep cycle, you have different parts of the brain active, and also different sets of hormones are being released, and to some degree, different levels or different kinds of repair and restorative activity that are happening. So in non-REM deep sleep, most of what's going on is like physical repair. So, it's and then the REM sleep part is more kind of cognitive and mental. So basically, if you, and we know this because, if you interrupt people's REM sleep consistently, it's harder for them to do stuff like learn new tasks and to, remember vocabulary if they're studying a foreign language, for example. And so from that, we can see that there is, it's not like, that the body uses sleep in somewhat different ways at different points in the cycle, but all of them, of course, are, have really significant value. There is also, the 8-hour sleep is a good estimate, but Nick Littlehales, who's a sleep scientist who's worked with a bunch of sports teams and other sorts of high performers, argues really that we should think in terms of 90-minute increments, and that we should think, and that the important thing is to get about 7.5 hours of sleep every 24 hours. So, so functionally what that means is that, if you're a professional tennis player, you fly to another time zone, you've got jet lag, what you're going to shoot for is, sleeping at night for, let's say, 6 hours and then getting a 90-minute nap or two, a 90-minute nap sometime during the day. Right. NBA players do something like this as well. There's something you have NBA nap time, which is like between about 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. because games are in the evening, then you go back, you have dinner and stuff. And these guys often don't get to sleep until like 3 a.m. And then you've got morning practice. And so their sleep is somewhat more bifurcated. But the bottom line is that thinking in terms of about 7.5 hours, which is about 5 90-minute cycles over the course of a 24-hour period. And that can be broken, that can be one long sleep session, or it can be broken up into, a couple or even 3 different ones, right? There are plenty of us get up in the middle of the night and you're up for you're up for a little while, you can't get back to sleep. That's actually very, very common, and it used to be pretty much ubiquitous a couple hundred years ago. But if you can get that body of sleep over the course of 24 hours, then you're probably going to be in pretty good shape.
What is the difference? So say you have a sleep deficit of 90 minutes, you're missing that whole cycle. Over time, what kind of impediment does that cause you?
So, over time, chronic sleep deficits are associated with higher levels of chronic disease, with potentially, it looks like, a greater risk of neurodegenerative or brain diseases, things like Alzheimer's and dementias. And of course, chronic sleep deficits also in the shorter run have a significant impact on your ability to perform at work and your even things like the likelihood that you will cut corners or cheat on the job if you think you can get away with it. So, I think you see this most acutely in fields like medicine and law enforcement, where you have people who are both under severe levels of stress and strain, who sometimes have to make decisions very, very quickly. And there's a really clear correlation between the likelihood that you'll commit an error either in the operating room or out in the field and your level of sleep deprivation. And so even if you're in a job where you're not faced with those kinds of life or death decisions, sleep deprivation is going to, extract a price in the short run, and in the long run, your body is really going to resent you for it, and is going to sort of act out in the form of chronic illnesses, shortened lifespan, lower quality of life at the end of your life. So get plenty of sleep.
Yeah, I know it impedes muscle growth and all kinds of physical recovery as well.
Yes.
In addition to cognitive. Yeah.
Right. No. And this is really important for kids and for athletes, right? I think that lots of trainers now recognize that you don't build muscle when you're working out. You actually build muscle when you're sleeping. The workout is when you generate the stuff that then gets repaired overnight that yields stronger muscles. And this is why people like, LeBron James, right? One of the most fearsome athletes of all time, he sleeps like 12 hours a day because that's what your body needs when you're performing at that kind of level. So even when you're that good and that dedicated, your body places demands on you that you really need to pay attention to if you want to keep performing that well.
One of the super fascinating things in your book was the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours of practice. And you said the study of those folks in the book was cut short because they did not show how much those same people had slept or had used rest to really get the outcomes that they were going for.
Mm-hmm. So, the story there is that the 10,000 hours rule has its origins in a fairly famous study, famous among social scientists anyway, of violinists at a Berlin conservatory. And they were interested in the question originally, is great performance as a violinist a genetic thing, or is it a matter of, just of practice? Is it nature or is it nurture, right? And they came down much more on the nurture side than on the nature, partly because, the evolutionary benefits of good violin playing are not necessarily that obvious, and it's not clear why that would develop. But they also saw a pretty clear relationship between both the number of hours that the top students performed and the way in which they were practiced and the way in which they practiced. They called it deliberate practice, right? Where you weren't just running scales, but you were focused on particular parts of your performance. You were getting clear feedback. You had very clear goals for improvement during those practice sessions. And the people who did that tended to need about 10,000 hours over the course of 10 years in order to become really, really good as performers. But they also, it turned out, there were two other things that distinguished them from the average performer. The first was that they actually slept more than the students who were in the middle of the pack, partly because lots of them would take naps in the afternoon. The second was they spent fewer hours total in doing leisure activities, but they were better able to explain why they chose those hobbies and what benefit it brought them. And so, it turned out that it wasn't just the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice that accounted for for their success. It was also the 12,500 hours of of deliberate rest and 30,000 hours of sleep. The other thing worth noting is 10,000 hours over 10 years is about 1,000 hours a year. And if you assume you take out some time for vacations and, and weekends, that if you assume people are doing that kind of practice 250 days a year, that works out again to about 4 hours a day, right? That same number that we see Hemingway, Darwin, Beethoven, famous mathematicians, et cetera, all gravitating toward. And so, whether you are, an 18-year-old violin prodigy or you're an 80-year-old, composer at the height of their powers, that 4 hours tends to be per day, tends to be the number to which, around which we all congregate.
It's amazing. We talked about flexible work hours, shorter, more focused days, the sleep. The other thing I want to dive into is this deep play in the Churchill story of what that is. Can you expand on that a bit? That was pretty fascinating.
Sure. So, one of the things that kind of mystified me when I was researching Rest was that a bunch of the people who I was looking at were in really, they were all without fail, incredibly ambitious. They were, super dedicated to their work. They often were, in priority discovery races, or, they were competing against other people in order to, to make this world-class discovery. And yet they would also take 3 weeks off and go to the Alps and go climbing or go sailing, or they had some other kind of really involved, often physically dangerous, time-consuming hobby that that also commanded their attention. And that seemed to me like kind of counterintuitive because why? So the question was, why would you spend your time and energy on something like this when you are, when it might, when there is a potential downside of, like losing a priority battle. And it turned out that the people explain their devotion to these really serious hobbies in ways that sounded really a lot like their devotion to their work. So, even though it was, Winston Churchill is a terrific example. He wrote a little book called Painting as a Pastime, where he talks about the value of painting for men of affairs and men of letters. He's writing in 1920 or so. So, it was, so it was men. But he talked about painting as being a great complement to in the life of a politician or a business person, because it was very, very different from the kinds of work that you did in, let's say, a law firm or a bank, right? It's very visual rather than numerical or textual. It's also something that took you out, that would take you into the outdoors or to museums, to places of culture. But it offered some of the same kinds of rewards that that public life offered, but in a very different medium. So for Churchill, painting was compelling not just because it was like time out in nature, blah, 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 but rather because painting was like politics. The rewards were the same. You had, in both cases, you needed literally a clear vision of what you were going to do. You had a certain amount of time in which to act. You had to think strategically about how you were going to capture this landscape or this particular scene, and you had a fixed amount of time in which to do it. In all this, it was rather like getting a bill through Parliament or winning a debate. But the difference was it was visual rather than verbal, and also when he was out painting, he didn't have the Labor Party standing behind him saying, sort of that tree is the wrong color, or trying to, erase the clouds over in the top right. So it was all the good stuff that he liked about political and public life without any of the downsides. And you see that kind of combination over and over again in serious hobbies, right? Scientists who are mountain climbers talk about mountain climbing as being like science, right? You're out in the world. It's this really intensive engagement with nature. It requires an incredible amount of focus and concentration. You cannot think about anything else when you're 2,000 feet up, sort of up a sheer cliff. You have to be really strategic about how you go about solving this gigantic problem. You break it down into 1,000 little parts and then you execute. On the other hand, when you're doing scientific research, you can spend a year working on a project and the answer may be totally inconclusive. When you're out on the mountain, either you make it to the top or you don't, right? There are very, very clear rewards. And so it is all the stuff that they like best about science in a very compressed time frame and in a very different context. And if you talk to military people or to CEOs who are mountain climbers, they will express the same kinds of sort of connections between what's rewarding about being out on the mountain versus sort of their day jobs. They'll just identify different things, right? For CEOs, it's about teamwork and collaboration and boldness. Or for military people, it's about you've got this incredibly difficult thing that you have to figure out how to execute on, and so it's and the mountain has plenty of challenges, but at least no one shooting back at you. So no matter what field. The challenge is to find that serious hobby that's that appeals, that delivers some of the satisfactions of work at its best, in a way that is, that takes you out of the office, and which can help remind you of what you like best about your work when it goes really well, which I think gives you both a degree of resilience when things don't, when things don't go so smoothly, but which gives you another place in which you can find those satisfactions, even when work itself is, work itself presents obstacles, or or you're facing unexpected challenges. So that's the story of deep play and why it really matters.
That makes sense. And when I find it working is when I embark on a hobby or I'm doing something that's making me very present. And that's why I think things like mountain climbing or adventure racing, or even maybe going to a concert that's more passive, is important, because you're not thinking about work. Unlike sometimes you could be on vacation sitting on a beach, you can't stop your mind from wandering, thinking about, what's happening in my email inbox or what's going on at the office. And that brings me to another question about vacation, because also you referenced the importance of people taking their vacation, but often you're on vacation, but your mind is on your work. So how do you parlay that?
The simple answer is leave your work phone at home, put an away notification on your email, and as much as possible, do not engage with work while you're on vacation. This is an unpopular theory, or particularly in an era when we carry our offices around in our pockets, and and we have plenty of formal and informal incentives to be always on and always connected. But in the long run, this is a bad thing. Humans benefit a lot from having really clear boundaries and having opportunities to switch off from work. And and I think that the evidence is that the better you are able to detach from work, whether it is nights whether it's weekends, whether it's on vacations, the better able you are to work when you are back in the office. And so I think that recognizing that and acting and having practices that help you preserve your both your free time and preserve your your ability to safely be out of the office is really important. Now, if you're in a place that makes that hard, right, where that encourages people to kind of take a sort of heroic view of their contributions to work, or that simply assume that you're going to come in from snorkeling and then it's no big thing, but you'll knock off email for an hour or so. Work environments like that are ones where this does become sort of more challenging. But to the degree that it's possible, maintaining those barriers, maintaining those boundaries is going to be good, is going to make for a much better vacation. It's also going to make you make you a better worker when you go back. And, and for most of us, it turns out those things that, that are waiting for us in our inbox actually can wait until we get back.
2 points on that. I actually had to deactivate one of my direct reports because I knew it was his honeymoon and I knew he wouldn't turn off notifications or email. I deactivated him as if he was no longer an employee, which
wow.
Yeah, I
Good
just
for
had to
you,
because
though.
I was like, I know what you're going to do and you're not going to do it. And he had major anxiety around it. I'm like, you know what? You came back and everything was okay.
This is so important because, I think one of the things that, because modeling this kind of behavior and making it possible is one of the most valuable things I think that leaders can do, right? Everybody has, clear short-term incentives to try and get the most work out of people. But, at the same time, if you want to cultivate people professionally, if you want them to, to see a path where they themselves can be, leaders in a few years, where they can be, where they can be world-class performers. I think that, helping them start to learn the lesson early on that you need to find ways to balance that passion, that expressing it just in terms of being always on or always in the office is not going to be healthy in the long run. And it's also, and after a few months is actually going to be counterproductive in the immediate run. That's a really important thing for us to teach to the people who work for us. And it's important for us to create the conditions that make it possible for them to put that into practice. And so I think this is the first example I've heard of deactivating someone's email. But absolutely right, and more power to you.
And when I did that, it made me realize that success, like to be a successful leader, is to have your team operate as if you're not there anyway. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you have to be on isn't a good thing. And trust me, I spent many years, I was an entrepreneur. It's my 10-year anniversary of having created a company. It's grown, very thankful. But for the most part of that 10 years, I thought success was determined by how much I could put in and the output I could generate. And then I realized that success is about the team under me. Can my team operate and can my company operate without me? And we're getting better all the time there, but it took a while for me to realize that. And I would say that if you are the type of person that is leading a team and you have to be on your phone or you have to be connected, you're not looking at success the right way. That's not you doing a good job. In fact, I'd argue it's the opposite, but I'm just giving you advice to really think about that and reframe it.
Absolutely right. No, I think that one of the downsides of the way that we think about entrepreneurship today in these sort of heroic terms tends to encourage a sense that you are the only person who can solve this problem, or you should be the only person who makes this decision or does this other thing, and that without you, the whole thing, the whole enterprise ought to fall apart. The danger, of course, is that's more likely to put you in the position where you actually do burn out and the whole enterprise falls apart. And so, I think that for the people I look at who move their companies to 4-day weeks, one of the things that they are really motivated to do is to change their organization from one in which they are absolutely completely critical to one in which, the founder is never going to be unimportant, but if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, people will know what to do. Other people will be able to step up, and the place will not fall apart completely. And I think that's a difficult thing to learn and to sustain these days, but it is absolutely, absolutely critical.
So I know we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. I have two more things for you. One, you wrote a book, The Distraction Addiction, in 2013, I think, around that time. Mm-hmm. And now things have gotten even worse, like significantly worse. And I look at my children, and I often ask this question, but you're like the best person to ask this to. I look at my kids compared to how I grew up with the cord on the phone, no real distractions in that way. And now everything's a distraction. This whole idea of just a kid being able to think and daydream, and it's kind of gone out the window because all these games are built in an addictive way, and they're, that's what they want to do when they get home from school. And for, in some cases that's okay because that's how they escape. How screwed are our children?
I think that the thing that I focus on is that, number one, kids' brains are highly plastic, right? There's this concept of neuroplasticity, which is a fancy way of saying that brains change all the time. And indeed, that's what brains do. So for all of, I think it is perfectly reasonable to be concerned or to think about how your kids spend their time, whether that is, and this would be true whether they are obsessed about baseball cards or Fortnite, but that, there is not an awful lot that kids do that completely permanently screws them up. And not a lot of what happens on screens is, falls into that category, which is not to say that, stuff like wasting time or cyberbullying is not an issue, but I think that that we don't have to panic if, if kids like screens more than we do. The other thing is that, I think that most of what we're really concerned about is actually, other people and behavior rather than interactions with photons and electrons. That, I worried more about about human interactions that went wrong online with with my kids than I did with the impact that screen time would have on cognitive processing. So, and then these days with, the pandemic, I'm afraid a whole bunch of that stuff has just gone out the window. So, it will be interesting to see over the next couple of years what happens, with kids who have been exceptionally online as opposed to extremely online. But I think that, I would encourage parents to worry a little less about the technology specifically and worry a bit more about the social interaction. The other thing I would point out is that we have this language about how about how technology is irresistible to kids. Well, any kid who plays sports is demonstrates a perfect capacity to put the phone away during basketball practice. If you have a coach who's going to yell at you for being on Snapchat when when they should be running stadiums, under the right circumstances, kids demonstrate perfect capacities for self-control and for and for putting their devices down. So let's not underestimate their capacity to do that, and look for ways that incentivize them to do so, when you don't have like someone with a clipboard running after you threatening to make you do extra laps.
Well, you made me feel better. Thank you for that answer.
Oh, good.
So the everyday worker that's listening to this, or the leader or the entrepreneur, whoever it is, what's the big message? What's the big takeaway? What can they do tomorrow to make their day a little bit better?
Right. So I would say that for, sort of the entrepreneur and leader, for everybody, that we need to recognize the value of rest and to take it more seriously in our lives, and to recognize that there is great value that can come from doing that at scale within organizations. What I would recommend for for entrepreneurs or for leaders of smaller organizations is to think about how you can take the lessons from companies that have moved to shorter weeks and bring those into your own organization. Even if you yourself cannot move to a 4-day week yet, those practices of using technology better, making meetings shorter, ring fencing time so that people have higher quality focus time as well as social time, those things are going to be valuable no matter what business you're in or what kinds of hours you work. For individuals, I think that recognizing that that there is real value to having better boundaries between work life and personal time, and that you're actually a better worker if you're able to detach and you have things like serious hobbies and deep play that can engage you and take your mind off work. That, both in the short run and in the long run, those things can be super valuable. And then recognize, second, that as important as it is to develop those kinds of things internally, that there's also a really big social and organizational dimension to our capacity or opportunities to rest, right? Rest and focus depend a lot on what other people expect of us and how other people behave. And so, I think that we often take organizational impediments to to rest, to work-life balance, to focus, and we translate them into personal ones. It's not that the system makes it really difficult to do this. It's that I don't know how to concentrate well enough. In fact, we live in worlds that conspire to capture our attention, to distract us, to commodify our attention, throughout our days, whether we're at work or at home, and recognizing that this is a hard problem, but it is one that we can learn to solve, and we can especially, and that it's especially valuable to learn how to do this together as well as through individual practices, is what I would, what I would tell individuals. That's not one thing that you do on Monday and then you're done, but it's more like a perspective to take you through the whole week and the next one and the next month and the next year. So that's the advice I would give people.
Right on. And if your company offers flexibility, take advantage of it. Don't feel like you still need to abide by the 9 to 5 or the 8 to 5 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the conversation and all the great advice today and your knowledge on rest. It was awesome. How can people find out more about you, Alex? And do you have another book coming out, or what are you working on now?
So my latest book, which came out last year, is called Shorter. It's about the global movement to a 4-day work week. Actually, here's a copy of it. And so, but you can find me on Twitter and other stuff at Ask Pang, AskPang. I'm also head of a small consulting company called Strategy and Rest, and that company URL is strategy.rest. And then finally, I'm also involved in a new campaign which we're ramping up to sort of launch a petition for for a 4-day week, and for company pledges for companies that want to try this themselves. A public pledge that will unlock some resources, advice about best practices, etc. And that's going to be at 4dayweek.us, and that's going to be launching at the end of June. So that's how people can find me.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll post all of that in the show notes. And again, can't thank you enough for your time today. And
Awesome.
Good luck with everything. You're on a great mission.
Thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure. So great to be on the show.
Thank you, Alex, for being an awesome guest on today's show. The conversation really reiterated my thoughts on flexible work schedules and a flexible work week, and to ensure people find times when they work best. I can't reiterate enough that focused 4 hours is so crucial. For me, it's in the morning. I can knock things out in the morning, and I try and focus on one major task per day. And I can tell you that I've learned over time, if you do that, you'll get far more done in a day than most people do the whole week chasing down a bunch of tasks. Also, sleep. That seems to be a theme running lately in these shows, and I know I have more episodes coming up on sleep. I've recently doubled down to try and get better sleep. I even bought some fun devices to see if they make any difference, like the Ooler, some sleep buds, a weighted blanket, a nice air filter near my bed for my allergies. That all being said, when my 9-year-old comes barreling in my room at 2 a.m., it doesn't matter what devices I have, my sleep is disrupted. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you do or use to get better sleep at night? We are obviously learning together how crucial sleep is, and it's something I want to put on the front burner, not the back burner in my life. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let me know your thoughts. As always, please share this with a friend if you think it could help them. And I hope you have a great week ahead. Remember, you, me, we are not almost there.